The weekend began like so many others before it, quiet, routine, and just a little chaotic in the way only children can bring. Julia had woken up early on Friday, earlier than usual for her day off, her heart already beating faster with anticipation. It was her turn to have Ella and Max, her two kids, for the weekend. A stretch of time she always looked forward to with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. Joy, because those were her children, her life, her everything. Heartbreak, because shared custody meant sharing their time, their milestones, and even their bedtime stories with a man who once promised forever but delivered betrayal instead. The divorce had finalized 8 months ago. It was civil on paper but cold and strained in reality. The custody arrangement had been negotiated down to hours and weekends, structured and legally rigid to avoid conflict. She and Brian rarely spoke unless it was a handoff or some emergency. Even the word emergency had been a point of contention during their mediation, as Brian had a history of manipulating narratives to suit his needs. Julia had learned to trust her gut after too many lies, but she also knew she couldn't deny her children their father, even if he had let them down before. Friday evening came with the usual clamor of voices and energy. Max, 9 years old, practically burst into her apartment with his backpack bouncing on his shoulders and a Lego set clutched tightly under his arm. Ella, 6, followed close behind, her tiny fingers wrapped around a worn ear of a stuffed bunny she named Buttons. Julia knelt to greet them both, arms wide open, pressing their warm little bodies against her chest, breathing in the scent of bubblegum shampoo and crayons. The night passed in happy routine. Pizza on the couch, popcorn during a movie, and a failed attempt at convincing them that bedtime at 9:30 was non-negotiable. Julia didn't mind. Their laughter, the sibling bickering, and the squeaky floorboards under running feet were the best sound she had heard all week. In those moments, she felt whole again. Saturday morning began gently. The sun filtered through the kitchen window as Julia cooked pancakes and brewed coffee. The kids were still in pajamas, playing with their breakfast more than eating it. Julia was mid-sentence, reminding Max not to pour syrup directly into Ella's milk when the doorbell rang. It was Brian. He wasn't supposed to come. According to the custody agreement, the kids were hers until Sunday at 6 p.m. Seeing him on her doorstep without notice or a text sparked immediate confusion. He stood there dressed casually, wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast, a nervous energy clinging to him like static. She stepped outside, gently closing the door behind her so the kids wouldn't hear. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral but firm. "There's an emergency," he said, voice low and rushed. "My mom had a fall. She's in the hospital. I need to see her, but I can't leave the kids alone. I was hoping I could take them just for a few hours, let them see her too. You know how close they are?" Julia frowned. "You could have called. I was driving. It happened an hour ago. I just thought, look, I'll bring them back by dinner, I swear. I just don't want them to miss this. What if it's serious?" It was classic Brian. Emotional appeal, vague urgency, manipulation coded in sincerity. But what tripped her up wasn't just his words. It was the fear of seeming unreasonable. What kind of mother would deny her children a visit to their grandmother in the hospital? Especially when it could be something serious? She hesitated, heart thudding with unease. She knew better than to trust him blindly. Too many broken promises. Too many moments where she'd been left picking up the emotional pieces after Brian changed plans last minute or prioritized his own whims over stability. But in that moment, pressed between uncertainty and fear of looking callous, she said yes. "Just a few hours," she said quietly. "Back before dinner." "I promise," he replied, eyes gleaming. He kissed her cheek lightly, a leftover reflex from a marriage long dead, and called for the kids. They were excited, of course. Seeing Dad and Grandma in one day, an unexpected adventure. They grabbed their jackets. Max carried his Lego box. Ella hugged Buttons tightly, and within minutes they were gone. Julia watched them pile into Brian's car, Max in the front seat, Ella in the back waving at her through the window. She smiled tightly and raised her hand. Then they disappeared down the road. By 4 p.m., she texted Brian, "All okay? What's the update on your mom?" No response. By 5:30, she called. No answer. She tried again at 6:15. Nothing. By 7 p.m., dinner cold on the stove, panic had settled in her bones like ice water. She texted again, Brian, where are the kids? You said you'd be back for dinner. Please call me. Nothing. She tried calling his sister. Voicemail. She called his old friend Mike. He hadn't heard from Brian in weeks. She tried his mother's landline, disconnected. She called the hospital nearest to Brian's last known address. No record of his mother being admitted. It was now past 9 p.m. Julia sat on the edge of her couch, phone trembling in her hand, stomach in knots. Her brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe he lost signal, maybe he was delayed, maybe it really was a medical emergency. But deep inside, something darker pulsed through her. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't bad reception. This was something else. This was a violation. She picked up her phone and called the non-emergency police line, breath shallow. She explained the situation, her voice cracking only once. The dispatcher took down the details and transferred her to a local officer. The conversation that followed was more frustrating than comforting. Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but since the father has shared legal custody, it's not technically considered kidnapping unless the custody order has been clearly violated. He has until Sunday at 6 p.m., right? Yes, Julia replied. Try not to scream. But he wasn't supposed to pick them up today. This wasn't part of the agreement. Was there a written restriction or emergency clause about unplanned pickups? No, but he took them under false pretenses. He said his mom was in the hospital. She's not. He lied. He won't respond. I understand, ma'am. But unless there's proof of endangerment or intent to flee with the children, there's not much we could do tonight. If he doesn't return them tomorrow as scheduled, that's when you can formally report it as a violation. Julia hung up the phone, feeling helpless. The law was clear, and yet it felt so wrong. Her children were missing. Yes, not technically abducted, not yet illegal, but they were gone, unreachable, and in the hands of someone she no longer trusted. She sat in silence. The night stretched long. Her thoughts became louder than any noise in the room. And then suddenly, a flicker of hope sparked. Buttons. Ella's bunny. A few weeks ago, after an unsettling incident where a babysitter had taken Ella to a park without telling her, Julia had purchased a small GPS tracker, one designed for children's bags or pets. It was discreet, the size of a quarter, and she had sewn it into Button's back seam, just under the left ear. Ella took that bunny everywhere, and she had it when she left with Brian. Her hands moved faster than her thoughts. She opened the tracking app on her phone, entered her password, and waited for the satellite ping. Her heart stopped when a map loaded. There, blinking steadily on the screen, was a dot. The tracker wasn't in town. It wasn't even the next town over. It was moving slowly along a rural highway, heading west, away from the city toward another state. Julia stared at the screen in disbelief. Her pulse surged. The room tilted slightly, and then, as the horror of realization sunk in, she stood. She knew now. Brian wasn't coming back, and tomorrow would be too late. Julia stood frozen in her living room, eyes locked on the pulsing blue dot moving steadily westward across the map on her phone. The glow of the screen lit up her worried face, casting long shadows under her eyes. It had been an hour since she realized Brian wasn't coming back. The weight of that truth hit her like a cold stone in the stomach. But now, staring at that tracker she had almost forgotten about, a strange clarity began to override her panic. She had proof. Proof that he lied. Proof that he was heading somewhere far away with the kids. And, most importantly, proof that she still had a chance to stop him. Her fingers trembled as she took a screenshot of the tracker's current location. She saved it, then took another. The dot was moving along Route 56, past the edge of the county. This was not a detour. This was a getaway. She backed out of the app and called the police again. This time, she didn't ask for help. She demanded it. I have a GPS tracker on my daughter's toy, she told the officer at the station. She took it with her. I can see exactly where they are right now. They've crossed into another county. He wasn't supposed to pick them up. He told me his mother was in the hospital, but she's not. This wasn't a custody handoff. It was a lie, and now he's crossing state lines. There was a pause on the other end. A longer one this time. What kind of tracker are we talking about? Bait geez. It updates every 30 seconds. I've got timestamp screenshots. Okay, Mom. That may change things. Julia held her breath as the officer put her on hold. She could hear muffled voices in the background, an exchange between officers, maybe a supervisor. She paced the room, pausing only to refresh the app and document another screenshot. The kids were moving about 25 miles from the city limits now. At their current pace, they'd be in the next state by sunrise. When the officer returned, his tone had changed. We're going to need you to come down to the station with your custody agreement and proof of the tracker's location. Bring anything that can help. Text messages, photos, emails. If what you're saying checks out, and especially if he's leaving the state without authorization, we may be able to escalate this to an unlawful removal case. Julia didn't wait for further instruction. She pulled her folder from the file cabinet in her bedroom, one she kept specifically for custody-related documents. She grabbed her laptop, phone charger, and the stuffed bunny's packaging box where she'd kept the tracker's serial number and receipt. She drove faster than she should have, hands clenched tight around the steering wheel, thoughts racing even faster than her car. She didn't cry. There wasn't time. Every emotion had congealed into pure focus. At the station, she was ushered into a small side office. A young detective with tired eyes and a half-drunk coffee sat across from her, quietly flipping through the paperwork she handed over. So, just to be clear, he said, you gave him temporary custody today under false pretenses, correct? I didn't give him anything. He showed up unannounced. Told me his mother had a medical emergency. I'll let the kids go with him for a few hours because he said they'd be back by dinner. And you have reason to believe that story was false? I called every hospital in town. No record of his mother being admitted. And he hasn't responded to a single text or call since he left. He's never done this before. The detective nodded, his expression unreadable. And the tracker? Julia pulled up the app again. She showed him a live feed, how the dot continued to crawl down the highway, far from any hospital or family home Brian had ever mentioned. She showed him the screenshots, the timestamps, the receipt for the device. The detective leaned back, rubbing his jaw. I'll be honest with you, Miss Wells. This is unusual. Technically, it's still within the time frame of his legal custody rights. But based on what you've shown me, and the fact that he's crossing jurisdiction, we have grounds to consider this a potential parental abduction under federal law. Does that mean you can find them? We can issue a bolo for the vehicle if we get confirmation he's left the state. But we'll need to escalate this through the district attorney. I'll call our family protection unit. In the meantime, don't lose that signal. Keep tracking it. If he stops somewhere, let us know immediately. Julia nodded, clenching her phone like it was a lifeline. She was given a place to sit in the waiting area as the detective made his calls. She sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, watching the app update every half minute. The dot turned off the highway and paused momentarily near a gas station in a small town called Danvers. Then it moved again, west, always west. Her heart ached imagining her kids in the back seat of that car, possibly asleep, maybe wondering why they hadn't returned home yet. Did Ella still have buttons in her arms? Was Max asking questions, noticing how long the drive was getting? Julia tried not to spiral. She focused on the facts. The tracker was still active. She hadn't lost them. At midnight, the detective returned. Good news, he said. Our district attorney's office approved an emergency motion. We've alerted the highway patrol in both this state and the bordering one. Since you have a valid custody agreement and evidence he misled you, we can treat this as custodial interference, which carries legal weight. Julia exhaled for the first time in hours. What happens now? If he gets pulled over, we'll detain him until family court sorts it out. Depending on what he says, he could face serious charges. You'll likely get a protective order and full custody during the investigation. But I'll be honest, if he crosses the border before patrol catches him, things get more complicated. Julia looked back at the app. The dot was moving slowly now, just outside of a place called Burnell, surrounded by forests and winding back roads. I think he's heading to that cabin, she said aloud, mostly to herself. What cabin? Julia turned to the detective. During our marriage, he used to talk about this off-the-grid place his cousin owned near the border. Said it was good for camping, isolated, no cell service. He always joked that if things ever went bad, he'd go live there. I never thought he was serious. Can you give us an address? I don't have one. Just a vague memory. Burnell, near a lake. His cousin's name is Travis Lane. He's got a criminal record, I think. Wasn't allowed near the kids. The detective stood up again. That's enough. We'll run it through our system. If he's going there, we'll find it. By 2 a.m., Julia was too tired to speak. Her eyes remained glued to the screen as the blue dot finally stopped moving. It settled on a patch of land west of Burnell, surrounded by trees and water. The detective confirmed it. An unlisted private cabin registered to Travis Lane with a history of unlawful weapons possession and resisting arrest. Police began preparing a quiet approach, not wanting to spook Brian into fleeing or doing anything reckless. We'll go in at dawn, the officer told her. We don't want to make a scene in the dark, but the moment we're in position, we'll act. Julia nodded. There was no sleep, no rest, just a long wait filled with quiet prayers, memories of bedtime songs, and the image of Ella hugging that little bunny tighter than ever. That toy, small, pink, and stitched with love, had become her children's silent guardian. Brian thought he had one. He thought he could outsmart everyone, vanish into the woods, and rewrite the rules to suit his delusions. But he didn't know that buttons carried more than comfort. He carried justice, and Julia wasn't letting go. Not this time. The early morning air was sharp and damp as the convoy of unmarked police SUVs rolled toward the rural outskirts of Burnell. Dawn hadn't yet broken, and the forest surrounding the narrow road was still shrouded in shadows and mist. Julia sat in the back seat of one of the vehicles, bundled in a borrowed police jacket, her fingers clenched tightly around her phone. The tracker's blinking blue hadn't moved in over 3 hours. It remained still on the edge of a wide, forested property nestled near Coldwater Lake. According to satellite maps, it was a cabin, wooden, isolated, likely without neighbors within miles. Brian had brought them here. Detective Morse sat beside her, a veteran with a calm demeanor, clipboard resting on his knee. He had briefed the officers during the drive, approached quietly, prioritized the children's safety, de-escalate unless absolutely necessary. Julia had listened, silent and sick with nerves. She hadn't slept all night, nor had she eaten. Her entire being was focused on one thing, getting Max and Ella back safely. As the vehicles slowed to a crawl, Julia caught her first glimpse of the entrance to the cabin property. The path was blocked by a rusted gate chained loosely to a leaning fence. Beyond it, a narrow dirt track wound through trees and disappeared into deeper woodland. A mailbox sat crookedly on a post with the faded name, Lane, still visible in peeling paint. One of the officers cut the chain with bolt cutters, and the lead vehicle crept forward. Julia wasn't allowed to go any further. She understood that, even agreed with it, but staying behind was excruciating. She sat in the back seat, watching the officers disappear into the forest, their radios crackling with hushed voices and check-ins. The cabin was only half a mile in, but it felt like an eternity away. Moore stayed with her, updating her every few minutes as information came in over the radio. 2 vehicles outside the cabin, he murmured. One matches your ex-husband's description. No lights inside. Curtains drawn. Julia stared through the windshield, heart thudding. They're in there. We'll move slow. No sirens. No knock on the door. We got people around the perimeter. It was a tactical move. They didn't want to risk Brian panicking, especially with the kids inside. This wasn't a dramatic TV takedown. This was a calculated operation, built around minimizing risk. Minutes passed like hours. Julia kept refreshing the tracking app even though she knew the bunny, and hopefully her daughter, hadn't moved. Her mind raced with scenarios, Brian refusing to surrender, threatening to run, waking the kids in a panic. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to breathe. She needed to stay grounded. She had already come so far. Then the radio buzzed. Visual on the children. Through the front window. Both asleep. No sign of the male subject yet. Moore sat forward. Copy. Wait for signal. Julia's breath caught. They were safe, at least for now. Another update followed seconds later. Subject located. Sleeping in armchair, front room. Officers moving in. And then silence. Every nerve in Julia's body stood on edge. The car felt like a pressure chamber. She stared at the trees, the fog, the empty road behind her. And then finally, the radio crackled again. Suspect in custody. No resistance. Children are awake. Frightened but unharmed. Julia collapsed against the seat, tears spilling from her eyes. Her entire body began to shake, a delayed wave of emotion crashing over her. She didn't realize Moore had placed a hand on her shoulder until she felt the weight. "They're safe, Julia. You did the right thing." It was hard to speak. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Can I see them?" "Soon. They're going to bring the kids out to a safe location. We'll reunite you there." 15 minutes later, one of the officers returned with news that the children were being transported to a nearby sheriff's outpost for medical checkups and to wait for their mother. Julia followed the lead vehicle through winding roads and early light, gripping the door handle with one hand and wiping tears with the other. When they arrived, the sun had begun to rise, casting a soft gold glow on the old brick building. As Julia stepped out of the car, she spotted Ella first, curled up on a bench in a police blanket, clinging tightly to buttons. Max stood next to her, visibly alert but visibly shaken, looking much older than his 9 years in that moment. "Mom." His voice cracked, and then he ran. Julia dropped to her knees as he flung himself into her arms, and she held him with all the strength she had left. Seconds later, Ella was in her lap too, crying and talking all at once about the scary cabin, how Daddy had told them it was a secret trip, how there was no phone, and they couldn't even watch cartoons. Julia kissed their heads, wiped their cheeks, whispered over and over that they were safe now, that everything would be okay. The officers gave them space. Moore approached eventually, offering her time to talk with social services later in the day. For now, she could take the kids home after a medical evaluation. Brian was being processed. Charges were being filed. Custodial interference. Endangering minors. Obstruction. It wasn't over, but it was ending. Later that morning, in the quiet safety of her living room, Julia sat on the couch with Max on one side and Ella on the other. The apartment felt warmer somehow. The familiar hum of the heater, the soft cushions, the scent of her children, it all grounded her again. Max looked up at her. "Mom, is Dad going to jail?" Julia paused before answering. "He's going to have to answer for what he did. Taking you like that, without asking, without telling anyone, it wasn't right. He made a very bad choice." Ella piped up, "But why didn't he just ask?" Julia hugged her tighter. "Because sometimes when grown-ups are hurting or confused, they make decisions out of fear instead of love. But that doesn't make it okay." She didn't talk about the court yet, or the restraining order that was already being drafted. That would come later. For now, she just let them be home, safe, warm, and wrapped in arms that would never, ever let them go without reason. That night, as she tucked them into bed, Max looked thoughtful. "Mom, how did you find us?" She smiled faintly, reached over, and gently pressed the stuffed bunny to Ella's chest. "Because buttons is magic," she whispered. "Egyagith." Max smirked, clearly unconvinced but comforted nonetheless. And Julia, as she stood in the hallway watching them sleep, allowed herself a rare, full breath. Her children were home. She had trusted her instincts. She had fought through legal fog and emotional terror. And she had won, because she never gave up, and because she'd quietly prepared for the worst. Brian hadn't counted on that. He had underestimated her resolve, her intelligence, and her love. But love, when matched with courage and clarity, had saved the day. And tomorrow, she would begin the next chapter, not as a victim, but as the fierce mother who outmaneuvered her past to protect her future. In the days that followed the rescue, Julia felt as though she were living inside someone else's story. A surreal haze of legal appointments, protective orders, police statements, and the constant tension of navigating trauma while pretending, for the sake of her children, that life was settling back into normalcy. She moved through each moment on instinct, each task handled with precision, but the weight of everything that had happened pressed against her bones like a cold, invisible cast. Brian was in custody, and the official charges had been confirmed: custodial interference in the first degree, child endangerment, and making false statements to law enforcement. He had waived his right to bail, likely under advice from his public defender. When Julia had first been told this, she'd stared blankly at the officer as if the words weren't real. But they were. Brian was behind bars, and for once, he wasn't the one dictating the terms of their shared life. The courts were now in control, and that reality shifted something inside her. The children were back in school by the following week, thanks to the calm and careful reintegration Julia had orchestrated with the help of a child therapist. She didn't want their fear to fester into long-term damage, so she had insisted on open but gentle conversations, a structured home environment, and the kind of warmth that made them feel anchored again. Still, Max had started sleeping with the hallway light on, and Ella hadn't let go of buttons since their return. Julia didn't push them. She knew wounds healed unevenly. One afternoon, while the kids were at school, Julia sat across from her lawyer in a small, sunlit conference room. Files were spread out on the table between them, each one labeled with the cold precision of the legal world. Custody violation, Brian Wells, emergency protective order, amendment petition, sole custody. She sipped her coffee slowly, fingers trembling just slightly. "I want full custody," she said. Her attorney, Rachel Myers, a sharp and experienced family law specialist, nodded. "You have every legal and moral reason to ask for it. With the evidence, the GPS tracking data, and the police report, there's no question he violated the court order and endangered the children." Julia looked out the window. The leaves on the trees had started turning orange and red, and a gust of wind pushed them sideways in erratic spirals. She felt as if she were watching the seasons shift, both outside and within. "I never wanted to keep them from their father," she murmured, "but he forced my hand. I can't, won't, risk them being taken again. Not even once." Rachel nodded again, softer this time. "The judge will understand that." The court date for the emergency custody hearing came 2 weeks later. Julia arrived at the courthouse in a navy blue dress and flat shoes, her hair pulled back, documents clutched tightly in her hand. The courtroom was quiet, almost sterile. Brian was brought in wearing handcuffs, his face gaunt and drawn. He didn't meet her eyes. That surprised her. He had always been confrontational, always ready to twist a narrative. But today, he looked small, shrinking under the weight of his own actions, maybe beginning to understand the full gravity of what he'd done. The judge was a woman in her early 60s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. She listened intently as Rachel laid out the facts. How Julia had entrusted Brian with temporary access under the belief of a family emergency. How that story was fabricated. How he drove the children across county lines with no communication. How a GPS tracker in a child's toy had been the only reason they were recovered without harm. Every screenshot, every call log, every hospital inquiry Julia had made was presented. Brian's attorney tried to argue diminished judgment, claiming emotional stress, disorientation, and an irrational fear that Julia was trying to replace him in the kids' lives. But it fell flat. His intentions had been too calculated, too deceptive. When the judge spoke, her voice was crisp and clear. "Mr. Wells, your behavior constitutes a severe breach of both legal and moral duty to your children. You demonstrated a complete disregard for the custody agreement and for their emotional safety. This court finds in favor of the petitioner. Effective immediately, full legal and physical custody is granted to Miss Julia Wells. Mr. Wells shall have no unsupervised contact with the children until further review by Child Services and completion of a psychological evaluation." Julia didn't cry. She sat still, the ruling echoing in her mind like a bell. It was over, at least this part. Outside the courtroom, Rachel hugged her lightly. "You did everything right. You were smart, you were calm, and you protected your kids. That's all any judge needs to see." Julia nodded, barely registering the congratulatory tone. Her victory wasn't one to celebrate. It was one to carry with quiet strength. Over the following months, life slowly returned to rhythm. Julia bought a small second-hand car to replace the aging sedan she'd used for years. She installed additional locks on her apartment door, more for peace of mind than necessity. She picked up an extra shift at the clinic to help cover legal costs. She also began attending a support group for parents who had experienced high-conflict custody disputes. There, she met other mothers and a few fathers who understood the fear and fury of navigating family court with a volatile ex. Their stories were different, but their pain was familiar. One night, after the kids had gone to sleep, Julia found herself sitting on the couch holding buttons in her hands. The little pink bunny was still in surprisingly good shape, though its ear was now a little lopsided from Ella's constant cuddling. She turned it over in her hands and gently pressed the seam where the GPS tracker still lay hidden. It had worked perfectly, quiet, loyal, unnoticed. A mother's instinct, disguised in a child's toy, had outwitted fear itself. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. Brian's attorney confirmed he's not contesting the supervised visitation requirement. They'll draft a proposal for monitored meetings next year, but it's up to you. Julia stared at the message for a while. The idea of letting Brian near the kids again was like stepping into a room filled with broken glass. Doable, maybe, but dangerous. She didn't reply. Not yet. Weeks later, on a Sunday morning, Julia and the kids took a walk through the local park. The leaves had fully turned now, and the air was crisp. Max rode his scooter ahead, and Ella skipped along beside her, swinging buttons in one hand. For the first time in a long time, Julia felt something resembling peace. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of control. "Mom?" Ella asked suddenly. "Yes, sweetheart. Is Daddy bad now?" Julia paused, crouched beside her, and looked her in the eyes. "No, baby. He made a very bad choice. But that doesn't mean he's all bad. It just means he needs help." Ella nodded thoughtfully, then hugged her bunny tighter. Julia stood and took her hand. She had no illusions that the road ahead would be simple. Co-parenting, if it ever resumed, would require boundaries as firm as steel. But she also knew this. She had done what too many were too scared to do. She had trusted her gut. She had spoken up when the system initially told her to wait. She had gathered evidence. She had acted. And in doing so, she had protected her children from a spiral that could have changed their lives forever. As they left the park, Max called out, "Race you to the gate," and took off sprinting. Ella squealed with delight and followed. Julia ran too, laughing despite herself, wind in her hair and the morning sun warming her skin. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't chasing a runaway situation, a broken marriage, or a vanishing car. She was simply chasing her kids, and this time they were running toward her.